Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. It started like any other night. A long stretch of empty highway, the glow of the dashboard lights, and the sound of the radio crackling in and out of static. But tonight something was different. Something was wrong. I first noticed the car when I was about 30 miles outside of town. Its headlights flickered in my rearview mirror, weaving in and out of focus like a phantom on the horizon. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had driven this route 1,000 times before, and there was always the occasional late-night driver trying to make it home. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized that no matter how fast I went, no matter how many turns I took, that car was still there. Always at the exact same distance, its headlights unwavering like two cold, glowing eyes fixed on me. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, feeling the skin on the back of my neck prickle. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. The road ahead was endless, disappearing into the inky blackness of the night, and there wasn't another car in sight. Just me and them. It wasn't until I tried to shake them that I realized something was very wrong. I slowed down, testing if they would pass. They didn't. I sped up, pushing my old sedan to its limits. They matched my speed effortlessly. It was like they were toying with me, letting me think I could outrun them, but always keeping just close enough to remind me they were there. An uneasy feeling settled deep in my gut. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some impatient driver trying to overtake me. Whoever, whatever was in that car was playing a game, and I was the target. I took the next exit, hoping to lose them in the maze of back roads that cut through the woods. The streets were narrower here, lined with dense trees that blocked out the moonlight. I turned off my headlights, driving in the dark, hoping to become invisible in the shadows. For a brief moment, the car disappeared from my mirror, and I felt a surge of relief. But then, out of nowhere, they reappeared. The headlights flared up behind me like two burning suns, impossibly bright, illuminating the entire road in front of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I swerved around a corner, tires screeching. I was trapped in a nightmare, racing through the dark, pursued by something I didn't understand. Panic set in. I could hear the roar of their engine now, louder, closer. It was like they were right on my bumper, even though when I looked in the mirror, they still seemed miles away. My pulse quickened, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I needed to get off the road. There was an old rest stop a few miles up. I remembered it from my childhood, back when my dad used to take me on fishing trips. It had been abandoned for years, but I figured I could hide there until whatever was following me passed by. I turned down the narrow dirt road, my tires kicking up gravel as I raced toward the dilapidated building. The headlights behind me vanished. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop in front of the crumbling rest stop. The silence was deafening. No engine, no headlights, just the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant chirp of crickets. My hands were shaking as I killed the engine, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. For a moment, I thought I had lost them. Then, I heard it, the soft crunch of gravel under tires, slow and deliberate. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. No lights. No car. Just the sound, growing closer, like someone was driving up behind me with their lights off. My heart raced. I fumbled for my keys, but they slipped from my hand and fell onto the floor. Cursing under my breath, I bent down to pick them up when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow moved outside the car. Not a person, but something darker. It moved unnaturally, like it was gliding across the ground rather than walking. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, watching as the shadow drifted closer to the passenger side of my car. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it pressed up against the window, its form vaguely humanoid, but distorted, wrong. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound shattered the silence, sending a jolt of terror through me. I scrambled for the keys, my fingers trembling as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, speeding out of the rest stop and back onto the road. The shadow disappeared, but the fear lingered, gnawing at my insides like a parasite. I didn't stop. Not until I was well out of the woods and back onto the main highway. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights again, but the road behind me was empty. For now, I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just some prank or that my mind was playing tricks on me after a long day. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something that had followed me, hunted me, and I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. A few days passed, and I tried to put the incident behind me, but the nightmares started soon after. In every dream, I was back on that road, driving alone in the dark, with the same pair of headlights trailing behind me, growing closer and closer. Every time, just as they were about to catch up, I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the car. I started seeing it everywhere, parked at the end of my street, sitting outside my office, even following me when I went to the grocery store. Always the same car, an old rusted sedan with dark windows that I couldn't see through. It never came close enough for me to confront it, but it was always there, watching. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. Every time I got into my car, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those headlights flare up in my mirror again. And every time I drove at night, I felt like something was lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness, waiting. Then, one night, it happened again. I was driving home from a friend's house, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. It was late, and the road was empty, just like before. I hadn't seen the ghost car in a while, and I had started to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I was in the clear. But as I rounded a bend, the headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. It was them. I could feel it in my bones. The way the lights flickered, the way the car stayed just far enough behind that I couldn't make out any details. It was the same car from that night, the same one that had been following me ever since. I floored the gas, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the highway. But no matter how fast I went, the car stayed right behind me, matching my speed effortlessly. The road ahead stretched into darkness, and I knew deep down that there was no escaping this time. I don't know what I was expecting, but as I approached a narrow bridge, something told me to stop. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was fear. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The car behind me did the same. I could see it now, closer than ever before. The dark, rusted sedan, its windows black and impenetrable. It just sat there, engine rumbling softly, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me. I didn't know what else to do. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. But before I could get more than a few feet, the car's headlights flickered once and went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, in the stillness of the night, I heard it. The tap, tap, tap on my window. I used to think night shifts were a blessing, a quiet time to work, less supervision, no distractions. But after what I went through, I can't look at working the night shift the same way again. Sometimes the silence isn't just peaceful, it's a warning. It all started when I took a job at an old printing press on the outskirts of town. The place had been around for decades, practically a relic from the 70s, but the pay was decent and the hours fit my schedule. I was hired to run the night shift, working alone in a building that should have been condemned. But I didn't mind. It felt like a good place to make some easy money. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I'd walk in just before sunset, grab a cup of terrible coffee from the break room, and get to work. The printing presses were loud and old, constantly needing maintenance, but I had a routine down. I kept to myself, ran the machines, and stayed out of trouble. By the time the sun rose, I was out of there and on my way home. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first, strange noises, odd flickers of light, but nothing I couldn't brush off. I figured it was just the building showing its age. The pipes groaned, the lights buzzed, and the whole place had a way of creaking when the wind picked up. Normal for a building that old, right? That's what I thought anyway. One night, about a month into the job, I was running the machines like usual when I heard footsteps. At first I assumed it was my boss coming in early to check on things, but when I looked toward the entrance, no one was there. I paused the machine and listened, straining to hear over the low hum of the press. There it was again. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around just out of sight. My heart raced a little, but I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Long hours, lots of noise. I was bound to hear things that weren't really there. But then the footsteps stopped, and the building went silent. Dead silent. Even the machines seemed to quiet down for a moment, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I shrugged it off, blaming it on fatigue. I went back to work, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but that was just the beginning. A few nights later, I was in the middle of changing the ink on one of the presses when I felt it, someone standing behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and a chill ran down my spine. I turned around expecting to see a coworker or maybe my boss, but the room was empty, completely empty. The only sound was the steady thrum of the machines. I laughed it off, trying to shake the creeping dread, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It felt like something was watching me, something I couldn't see. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting someone, or something, to be there, but every time I looked, the room was as empty as it had been all night. After that, things started happening more frequently. One night, as I was walking down the hall to the break room, the lights flickered and went out. I stopped dead in my tracks, frozen in the pitch-black corridor. My phone was back at my workstation, and I didn't have a flashlight. I stood there in the dark, trying to decide whether to go back or press forward. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. They were slow, methodical, echoing through the empty hall. But this time, they were closer, much closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was moving in the darkness. I backed up, my hand brushing against the wall as I fumbled my way toward the main room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the door, flung it open, and stumbled back into the light. The presses were still running, the room bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. For a moment, I stood there, trying to calm my nerves, but something wasn't right. I walked back to the control panel, but stopped dead in my tracks. The machines, every single one of them, had stopped. I hadn't noticed it in my panic, but the whole place was deathly quiet. The presses, which should have been thundering with noise, were completely silent. I hesitated for a moment before approaching the nearest machine. I tried to restart it, thinking maybe there'd been a power surge, but nothing happened. Confused, I walked back to the breaker room to check the switches. That's when I saw it. There was a man standing in the hallway, just at the edge of the light, half hidden in shadow. I froze, my eyes fixed on him. He was tall, with his back to me, his head slightly tilted like he was listening to something. My voice caught in my throat. I tried to call out, to ask who he was, but the words died in my mouth. I took a step forward, and that's when he turned around. His face. There was no face, just a void, a black, hollow space where his features should have been. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, as the faceless man began to walk toward me, his footsteps eerily quiet despite the echo of the empty building. I bolted for the exit, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't look back, didn't care if I left the machines running or if my shift wasn't over. All I knew was I had to get out of there. As I burst through the door into the cold night air, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My head spun and my vision blurred. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the feeling of dread still clung to me. I didn't go back to work the next night, or the night after that. I told my boss I was sick, made up excuses, anything to avoid setting foot in that building again. But eventually, the calls stopped. No one from the company followed up with me, which I found strange. But I didn't care. I was done with that place, at least I thought I was. 2 weeks later, I was at home, lying in bed, trying to forget about everything that had happened. I told myself it was all just stress, exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations from too much caffeine. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head, until the nightmares started. Every night I dreamt of the printing press, of the machines, the flickering lights, the faceless man. In the dreams I was always running, trying to get out, but the building seemed to stretch on forever. The walls would close in around me, and no matter how fast I ran, I could feel the faceless man closing in behind me. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of printing presses. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but the noise was real. The rhythmic thumping, the hiss of paper sliding through the rollers, it was the sound of the old machines from the press coming from outside my window. I got up, heart pounding, and cautiously approached the window. I pulled back the curtain and stared out into the night. The street was empty, the neighborhood quiet, but the sound of the presses was unmistakable. I could hear them, faint but steady, as if they were calling me back. I slammed the window shut, trying to block out the noise, but it didn't stop. It followed me. The sound haunted me, growing louder with each passing night, no matter where I went. In my car, at the grocery store, even in the park. It was like the machines were alive, their ghostly presence stalking me through the world. Desperate, I tried to reach out to my former boss, but I couldn't get through. The number had been disconnected, and when I drove back to the press, I found the place boarded up. A weathered for sale sign hung crookedly from the fence, the windows dark and dusty. It was as if the whole place had been abandoned for years, even though I'd been working there just weeks before. I asked around, trying to find anyone who knew what had happened, but no one could give me a straight answer. Some people didn't even remember the place. Others told me strange stories about workers who had gone missing, about accidents that had shut the press down years ago. But none of it made sense. I'd been there. I'd worked those machines. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew I wasn't the only one. The final straw came one night when I heard the footsteps again. This time they weren't in my dreams. They were right outside my bedroom door. I sat up, holding my breath, listening as they moved closer, slow and deliberate, like they were coming for me. I didn't wait to find out who or what was on the other side. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the house, and drove as far as I could. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't go back. The machines, the footsteps, the faceless man, they're still out there. And I have a feeling they won't stop until they find me. The night shift was supposed to be quiet, peaceful even. But there's something about those hours when the world is asleep, when the shadows grow longer, and the silence becomes deafening. I'm not one to believe in the paranormal. Ghost stories, haunted houses, none of it ever made sense to me. But when you've lived through something, when you've survived something like what happened to me last year, you start to reconsider everything you thought you knew about the world. Some houses aren't just haunted, they're something much worse. They're cursed. They're alive. And they want you. It was my first house. A fixer-upper, sure, but it had potential. My wife Sarah and I had always dreamed of owning a home, and after years of saving, we finally made it happen. It was an old Victorian, the kind of place that oozed charm from the outside, but creaked with the weight of its history on the inside. I can still picture it now, towering over the other homes on the block like a Gothic monument to another time. The realtor had glossed over the house's history, and honestly, I hadn't thought to ask. The price was right, and I figured that's all that mattered, but almost immediately I could feel something was off. The air in that place was heavy, like it had weight to it. Every time I stepped inside, my chest tightened, but I brushed it off as nerves. Moving into a new house is always stressful, right? We moved in during late fall, and by the time we'd settled, winter was fast approaching. The days got shorter, and that's when things started to happen. At first, it was little stuff. Strange noises in the night, the feeling that you weren't alone even when you knew you were. Doors I was sure I'd closed would be wide open when I passed by them again. Lights flickered, but I chalked it up to old wiring. I was a rational guy, so I looked for rational explanations. But then, one evening, Sarah told me she'd seen someone standing in the upstairs window. I was in the living room at the time, and no one else was in the house. It was probably just a reflection, I said, trying to reassure her even though I felt a knot form in my stomach. I didn't admit it at the time, but the same day while I was in the basement trying to get the furnace working, I'd heard footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate steps. When I ran upstairs, no one was there. I convinced myself it was just the sound of the house settling. But then the dream started. It was always the same. I'd find myself walking through the house in the middle of the night. Everything would look exactly as it did in real life, down to the shadows cast by the moonlight spilling through the windows. But in the dream, I was never alone. Something was always following me. I never saw it, but I could feel it. This overwhelming sense of dread pressed down on me, and I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. One night, though, I didn't wake up right away. In the dream, I was walking down the hallway toward our bedroom when I heard it. A whisper. My name, but in a voice that didn't belong to Sarah. Cold, raspy, and full of malice. "Adam," it called. I turned, slowly, every fiber in my body screaming for me to run, but I couldn't. Standing at the end of the hall was a figure, tall, black as the void, its face twisted in a grotesque grin that stretched far too wide for anything human. I woke up just as it lunged at me. I sat up in bed, breathing hard, my heart pounding. The room was cold, freezing, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. Sarah stirred beside me, mumbling something in her sleep. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I decided to do some digging into the history of the house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, and I needed answers. I went to the local library, searching through old records, news clippings, anything I could find about the property. That's when I found it. In 1905, the house had been owned by a man named James Harrow. Harrow was a recluse, an oddball by all accounts, but it wasn't his eccentricity that had piqued my interest. It was his death. According to the reports, he'd gone mad, claiming the house was speaking to him, telling him to do terrible things. One night, in the dead of winter, he had locked himself in the basement and slit his own throat, leaving behind a note written in blood on the walls. The words chilled me to the core. The house is alive. It demands a soul. I felt sick. The house, the place I had been calling home, had a dark, violent past. And now, I was beginning to think that whatever madness had consumed James Harrow wasn't confined to history. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. That night, I told Sarah everything. She looked at me like I was insane, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She'd heard the whispers too, seen the shadows moving in the corners of her vision. She had just been too scared to say anything. We agreed to leave, pack up, and sell the house. But we never got the chance. The night before we planned to leave, it all came to a head. It was late, past midnight, and I was lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the house creak and groan in the wind. Then suddenly the temperature dropped, so cold I could see my breath. The lights flickered, and I heard it. Those same heavy footsteps I'd heard so many times before, but now they were louder, closer. Sarah sat up beside me, her eyes wide with terror. "Adam," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Before I could respond, the door to our bedroom slammed shut and the temperature plummeted even further. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. And then, from the far corner of the room, came that voice. "Adam!" It was closer now, so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I turned and there it was, the figure from my dreams, towering over me, its grin wider than ever, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Sarah screamed, but it was cut short as the thing reached out, its long clawed hand wrapping around her throat. I wanted to help her, but I couldn't. All I could do was watch as the thing tightened its grip, lifting her off the bed. "Leave us alone," I finally managed to shout, my voice cracking with desperation. The figure turned its gaze to me, its grin fading into a look of pure hatred. It dropped Sarah, and she collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air. The creature loomed over me, its face inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, seeping into my bones. "The house needs a soul," it whispered, its voice like nails scraping against glass. "Yours." In a flash, the figure was gone, the lights flickered back on, and the temperature returned to normal. Sarah was coughing, clutching her throat, but she was alive. We left the next morning, abandoning the house and everything in it. We never went back. I don't know if the house found another soul to take, and honestly, I don't care. All I know is that some houses aren't just haunted, they're cursed, they're alive, and they're always hungry. I'll never forget that night. The night I came face to face with the darkness that lived within those walls. And I'll never stop wondering if one day it will come looking for me again. You hear about curses all the time. You watch documentaries, read articles, and think to yourself, that's just ancient superstition. That's what I thought too. I used to laugh at the idea of an old tomb holding some mystical power, ready to unleash chaos on anyone foolish enough to disturb it. But then I went to Egypt, and everything I thought I knew unraveled. It started with an invitation. Dr. Lawrence Stone, a world-renowned archaeologist and a professor at my university, had been leading an expedition in the Valley of the Kings. After years of searching, he had finally uncovered what he believed to be the tomb of an unknown pharaoh. I had taken a few of his classes, and though we weren't particularly close, he reached out to me with an opportunity that was too good to pass up. "Daniel," his email read, "we're on the brink of something extraordinary. I could use an extra set of hands. Come to Egypt. This could change history." I wasn't an archaeologist, just a history major with a fascination for ancient Egypt, but the chance to be part of such a monumental discovery, I couldn't say no, so I packed my bags and flew halfway around the world, excited to be part of history in the making. When I arrived at the dig site, I was greeted by Dr. Stone and his team. The energy was palpable. They were on the cusp of something huge, and I could feel it. The tomb's entrance had been revealed just a few days earlier, and Dr. Stone was eager to open it and begin the real work. He called it the Tomb of Nebket, a pharaoh with no mention in any historical records. If his theory was right, this was a discovery that could rewrite everything we knew about ancient Egypt. The first night at the camp, we gathered around a fire. The desert stretched out endlessly under a star-filled sky, and the team was buzzing with excitement. But there was one person who wasn't joining in on the celebrations, our local guide, Amir. He sat apart from the group, his eyes dark and haunted. He kept muttering something under his breath, something in Arabic that I didn't understand. I asked Dr. Stone about it, and he waved it off. "Superstition," he said. "Amir's family has been working these digs for generations. He's just nervous. There's a lot of talk about curses around here." "Curses?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, you know the stories. The curse of Tutankhamun, mysterious deaths, that kind of thing. It's all nonsense, of course, but the locals take it seriously." I tried to laugh it off, but Amir's demeanor unnerved me. There was something in his eyes, fear maybe, or worse, knowledge of something we weren't prepared for. The next day we opened the tomb. As the stone door shifted and groaned, revealing a dark, stale passageway, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air that escaped was ancient, and it smelled of dust and decay. We descended into the tomb with flashlights and lanterns, our footsteps echoing eerily in the narrow stone corridors. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became. The walls were adorned with intricate hieroglyphics, all telling the story of Nebket. He was a warrior pharaoh, known for his cruelty and his unyielding power. He had ruled with an iron fist, and according to the inscriptions, he had sealed himself in this tomb to escape a prophecy that foretold his downfall. We finally reached the burial chamber, and it was breathtaking. Gold-lined walls, intricate carvings, and a sarcophagus that gleamed in the dim light. This was the find of a lifetime. But something wasn't right. Amir, who had followed us into the tomb despite his obvious reluctance, stood frozen at the entrance to the chamber. He was pale, his breathing shallow. He pointed to an inscription on the wall, his hand trembling. Dr. Stone translated aloud. "He who disturbs the sleep of the pharaoh will be met with the wrath of the gods. Death is only the beginning." "Typical curse warning," Dr. Stone said with a chuckle. "You find them in every tomb. Don't let it scare you, Daniel." But it did scare me. The air in the chamber felt heavy, like something unseen was watching us, waiting. And Amir's silence screamed louder than any words could have. We spent the next few days cataloging the tomb, carefully documenting every artifact. It was hard, exhausting work, but the excitement kept us going. Dr. Stone decided to open the sarcophagus on the fourth day. As the stone lid was lifted, revealing the mummified remains of Nebket, I felt that same chill from before, only this time it was worse. The mummy lay perfectly preserved, its wrappings intact, but there was something wrong with its face. Unlike most mummies whose features are hidden beneath layers of cloth, Nebket's face was exposed, his skin taut and dry, his eyes sunken but disturbingly intact. The expression was one of fury, a look so intense it felt as though he had died in the middle of cursing whoever would find him. That night, it started. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep when I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside. Soft at first, barely noticeable over the desert wind, but they grew louder, more deliberate. I sat up, my heart racing. I unzipped the tent and peered out, expecting to see one of the team members. But there was no one there. The camp was still, silent, save for the occasional gust of wind. But then, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the dig site, near the tomb's entrance. Tall, draped in shadow, with something hanging from its face. At first I thought it was one of the workers, but then I realized what it was. Bandages. Old, decayed, barely clinging to the body of something impossibly ancient. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The next morning, I told Dr. Stone what I had seen. He laughed it off, of course, saying it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But Amir was listening, and his face darkened. "You've seen him," he said, his voice low and full of dread. "Seen who?" I asked. "The pharaoh, Nebket." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. That day, strange things started happening. One of the workers fell ill, a sudden fever that left him delirious. He kept muttering about shadows moving through the camp, about voices calling to him in the night. Another worker, a young woman, disappeared. We searched the area, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as though the desert had swallowed her whole. Dr. Stone refused to stop the excavation. He was too close, too invested to let superstition get in the way. But I could see the fear creeping into his eyes, the cracks in his confident facade. He tried to brush it off as coincidence, but the atmosphere at the camp was changing. The air felt thick, oppressive, like we were being suffocated by something unseen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my tent, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time they were inside the camp, circling my tent. I held my breath, listening as they stopped just outside the entrance. Then the flap of my tent moved, just a fraction, like someone, or something, was testing it. I shot up, grabbing the flashlight from beside me, and flicked it on. The light illuminated nothing but empty space. I stepped out of the tent, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The camp was silent, but then, at the edge of the tomb's entrance, I saw it again, the figure standing still, staring at me. Nebkit. I ran to Dr. Stone's tent, shaking him awake, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I told him everything, about the footsteps, the figure, the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He looked at me like I was losing my mind, but before he could say anything, we heard a scream. It was Amir. We bolted from the tent and found him at the tomb's entrance, his eyes wide with terror, pointing inside. "He's awake," Amir whispered, his voice trembling. "The Pharaoh. He's awake." Dr. Stone tried to calm him down, but Amir was hysterical. He kept repeating the same thing over and over. "The curse is real." That was the last night anyone stayed in that camp. We packed up and left the next morning, abandoning the dig, leaving behind the artifacts and Nebket's tomb. Dr. Stone tried to rationalize it, tried to explain away the disappearances, the sickness, the fear that had taken hold of us all. But deep down we knew we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. I never went back to Egypt. Dr. Stone? He disappeared 6 months later, just vanished. No trace. No explanation. Amir said it was Nebket's revenge, the curse claiming its final victim. I'm inclined to believe him. To this day, I can't close my eyes without seeing that figure in the shadows, its bandaged face twisted in fury. I'm haunted by the footsteps, by the whispers in the dark, by the knowledge that some things aren't meant to be uncovered. Some curses are real, and I fear that one day, Nebket will come for me too. I always thought stalkers were obsessed people. You know, someone with twisted affection, lurking in the shadows, trying to get close in ways that feel like an invasion of your soul. But I learned the hard way. Sometimes stalkers aren't people at all. It all started when I moved to a small town nestled in the middle of nowhere. You know the kind, where the locals all know each other's business, and if you're new, everyone watches. I had just gotten out of a messy breakup and wanted to disappear for a while. Renting a tiny cabin near the edge of the forest seemed like the perfect way to hit the reset button. Quiet, isolated, and most importantly, no memories of him. I didn't expect to feel watched from the very first day. At first, I shrugged it off. Being alone in a new place has its way of messing with your mind, but it wasn't just a feeling. It was physical, like someone was always standing just outside the corner of my eye, watching. That sensation followed me from the cabin to the town and back again. It was my second night there when things started getting weird. I was sitting on the porch, the air crisp with the coming fall, staring out into the dark woods that pressed up against the back of the cabin. That's when I heard it. The sound of leaves crunching, slow, deliberate steps. My first thought was a deer or some other animal. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw it, a figure just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape. It didn't move, but I knew it was looking at me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I would have liked. No response. The figure didn't flinch. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it melted back into the shadows. I told myself it was a trick of the light or some random hiker, but the knot in my stomach refused to untwist. The next morning, I walked into town, hoping to meet some locals and ask about the forest. The townsfolk were friendly enough, but when I mentioned seeing someone in the woods, their faces clouded over. One of the older men at the general store, a grizzled guy named Clyde, gave me a warning. "Don't go out at night," he muttered, his voice low like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Especially near the woods." "Why?" I asked, half joking, trying to hide the growing unease. "You got Bigfoot running around." His eyes locked onto mine, cold and serious. "There's things in those woods that ain't animals. Ain't people either. Just don't go looking." I laughed it off, but the way he said it, the intensity of his stare, it stuck with me. That night, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. As the sky darkened, I locked the doors and windows, pulling the curtains tight. But I didn't feel safe, not even close. I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps just outside. This time they were closer, right at the edge of the yard. I was frozen, straining my ears, trying to figure out if it was an animal or something worse. The steps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whoever, whatever it was, knew I was listening. They stopped right beneath my window. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peeked out through a small gap in the curtain. At first, I saw nothing but the dark expanse of the yard. But then, I saw it, standing right in front of the porch steps. The same tall, thin figure from the night before, but this time it was closer, close enough that I could make out details. Its body wasn't right. The limbs were too long, too angular, and its head didn't have a face. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, and I stumbled backward. I don't know what I was expecting, but not that. I slammed the curtains shut, heart racing. There was no way this was happening. It had to be a nightmare. The footsteps started again, but now they were heavier, faster, circling the house like a predator stalking prey. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. "We'll send someone out," the dispatcher said, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Who would? Faceless stalkers in the woods didn't exactly sound sane. I paced around the room, trying to calm my racing thoughts when I heard a knock on the window. Not a loud bang, just a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I stopped, holding my breath. Slowly, I turned towards the window. Another tap, 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 like it was trying to get my attention. I walked over, gripping the edge of the curtain, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Just as I was about to pull it back, I heard a voice. "Let me in." It was low, gravelly, and wrong. There was something inhuman about the tone, like it wasn't used to forming words. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to run, to hide. But I couldn't move. "Let me in," it repeated, the voice scraping against my ears. I stepped back, tears stinging my eyes. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. I fumbled with my phone, checking the time, 2:47 a.m. How long had I been standing there? When I glanced at the window again, the tapping had stopped. But I knew it was still there, just waiting. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. I sat on the floor, curled up in a ball, praying for morning. Every time I heard a creak or a whisper of wind, I jumped. But the knocking never came again. Not that night anyway. When the police finally arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to back up my story. I could tell by their expressions they thought I was losing it. maybe suffering from some kind of post-breakup paranoia, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. I kept the lights on, the curtains closed tight, waiting for the tapping, the voice, the faceless figure to return. But days passed, and nothing happened. Slowly I began to convince myself it had all been in my head. Maybe I really had imagined it all. Maybe I was just unraveling after all the stress and the move. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. I lay there, paralyzed, listening. Soft, shuffling footsteps moved through the cabin, slow and deliberate, just like before. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside. I wanted to scream, to jump up and run, but my body refused to obey. My breath hitched as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the hallway bathed in dim moonlight. And there it was, the same tall, faceless figure standing in the doorway, its long fingers brushing the frame. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me without eyes, without a face, without anything. My throat was dry, heart pounding in my ears as I stared at the thing in disbelief. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to do something, but all I could do was lie there, frozen in fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and left. The footsteps faded into the distance, and the door swung shut with a soft click. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it chose to follow me. But I've never forgotten the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something that wasn't human. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that tap, tap, tap on the window, and I wonder if it's finally come back for me. I've always been fascinated by dark history, abandoned asylums, forgotten graveyards, and infamous prisons. I guess that's what led me to Alcatraz. Growing up in the Bay Area, it was impossible to ignore the haunted tales of The Rock, an isolated fortress sitting ominously in the middle of San Francisco Bay, infamous for housing the country's most dangerous criminals. But it wasn't the crime or the escape attempts that intrigued me. It was the ghosts. Everyone knew Alcatraz had a dark energy. Visitors reported cold spots, disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and unexplained phenomena. Some even swore they heard cell doors slamming shut long after the prison closed. I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, but the stories gnawed at the back of my mind, daring me to see for myself. So when I saw a flyer for an overnight ghost tour of Alcatraz, I knew I had to go. I didn't tell my friends or family. They would have laughed, called me crazy for wanting to spend a night in one of the most haunted places in the world. But I needed this, something to shake me from the monotony of everyday life. The night of the tour, the fog rolled in thick, covering the water like a blanket as I boarded the ferry. The other participants chatted excitedly, snapping photos of the island as it grew larger in the distance. But I kept to myself, staring out at the dark silhouette of Alcatraz, feeling an odd sense of dread settling into my bones. As we docked, the tour guide, a thin, pale man who seemed far too cheerful for the setting, welcomed us to the island. He told us the usual stories. Al Capone, the Birdman of Alcatraz, the infamous escape attempts. But when we entered the main cell block, his tone changed. His voice lowered as he spoke of the prison's past, the violence, the isolation, the countless men who died within these cold stone walls. He pointed to certain cells, telling us of the suicides, the murders, the men who lost their minds in solitary confinement. And then, of course, there are the ghosts, he said with a sly smile, his eyes scanning the group. Some say they're still here, watching. The air in the cell block felt thick, heavy. I could feel a chill creeping over my skin as I followed the group down the narrow hallway. The cells were small, claustrophobic, each one a tiny cage that once held someone desperate to escape. Some doors stood wide open, others sealed shut, as if trapping whatever might be inside. We reached the solitary confinement cells. The hole, they called it. The guide explained that these cells were used to break the prisoners. No light, no sound, just an endless void. Men would lose their minds after days, even hours, in these tombs. And some, he claimed, never left. "Feel free to step inside," he offered, gesturing to one of the open solitary cells. "If you're brave enough." A few people in the group laughed nervously but stepped back, unwilling to enter. But me? I didn't hesitate. Something pulled me toward that dark cell, something that whispered to me in a voice I couldn't understand. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the blackness, the cold air pressing in around me. The door clanged shut behind me. For a moment, I thought it was the guide, playing some sick joke. I reached out, running my hands along the rough walls, but I couldn't find the door. My heart pounded in my chest as panic set in. I banged on the walls, calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was soft, like the faintest breath against my ear. I whipped around, but the cell was empty. There was no one there. My pulse quickened as the whisper came again, louder this time. Words, faint, indistinct, but definitely words. I froze, listening intently. "Help. Me." The voice was clear now, desperate, pleading. My throat went dry as I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing. Someone had to be messing with me. This was part of the tour, right? Just a trick to scare people. But the longer I stood there, the colder the air grew, and the whispering didn't stop. "Help me." It was closer now. Too close. I could feel the presence of someone, something, standing right behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, my skin crawling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Suddenly, the door flew open and light flooded the cell. The guide stood in the doorway, grinning. "How was it?" he asked, oblivious to the terror still gripping me. I stumbled out of the cell, my legs weak, my heart racing. There was someone in there," I stammered. But the guide just chuckled. "It's the wind," he said dismissively. "Happens all the time." I knew what I heard. That wasn't the wind. The rest of the tour passed in a blur. My mind was racing, replaying the whispers, the feeling of being trapped in that dark cell. But the worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. Even as we moved through different parts of the prison, I felt it, a presence, lingering just out of sight, watching, waiting. The tour ended, and most of the group boarded the ferry to head back to the mainland. But I, along with a few others, had signed up for the overnight experience. We were given free rein to explore the prison, and as the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. I wandered alone through the darkened halls, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. The wind howled outside, rattling the old rusted bars, and every creak and groan of the building echoed through the emptiness. I found myself drawn to the hospital wing. The guide had mentioned it earlier, but we hadn't spent much time there. The long, narrow hallways were lined with decaying medical equipment, rusted beds, and cracked mirrors. It was colder here, the chill seeping into my bones. As I walked past an old operating room, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I stopped, straining my ears. Tap, 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 like fingernails drumming on a hard surface. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed only an empty corridor. I turned to leave, but the tapping followed. Louder now, faster. I whipped around, shining my flashlight frantically. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness itself, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. The shadow shifted, inching closer, but still I couldn't make out any details, just a shape, a figure, wrong. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty prison. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, to get out. I reached the main cell block, my lungs burning, but something was wrong. The others, they were gone. The guide, the few remaining visitors, vanished. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing, and then the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now, right behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and there it was, the shadow figure standing in the middle of the cell block, its form flickering like a dying flame. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shadows emerged from the cells, dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel their eyes on me, boring into my soul. These weren't just echoes of the past. These were the spirits of the damned, trapped in this hellish prison, and they were angry. The whispers started again, filling the air with their desperate, pleading voices. Help us. Save us. But I couldn't. I couldn't do anything but run. So I did. I ran out of the cell block, down the stairs, through the yard, and toward the dock where the ferry had been. But the ferry was gone. I was stranded. The fog rolled in thicker now, swallowing the island, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I stood on the edge of the dock, staring into the dark water, knowing there was no escape. The last thing I remember before the darkness closed in was the cold hand gripping my shoulder and the voice, so clear, so close, whispering in my ear, "You're one of us now." And then, nothing. They found me the next morning, huddled on the dock, shaking and incoherent. The ferry captain said I was babbling about shadows and whispers, about ghosts that weren't supposed to be real. But I know what I saw, what I heard. The ghosts of Alcatraz are real, and they're still there, waiting for someone else to step into the dark, haunted halls of that cursed prison, just like I did. I was never the type to scare easily. 29 years in this world had given me a decent set of nerves, and living in the city of Milwaukee, I'd seen my share of weird things. Drunks stumbling down alleyways, the occasional police chase, once even a man walking around downtown with a pet iguana perched on his shoulder like it was normal. But nothing prepared me for the night. The black car started following me. It all began after a late night at work. I'm a bartender at one of the dive bars near the lake, a place where the regulars could drink themselves half blind without spending a fortune. The kind of job that puts you out on the street well after midnight, when the world starts to feel eerily quiet. That night was no different. I finished cleaning up the bar, said goodbye to Tony, the bouncer, and headed for my beat-up Honda parked a couple of blocks away. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. A black car, maybe 10 feet behind me, moving slowly as I walked toward my car. It was one of those sleek, older sedans, the kind of car you'd expect a businessman to drive in the 90s. I couldn't make out the driver's face through the tinted windows, but that wasn't unusual, right? People drive around all the time. Milwaukee's streets aren't exactly deserted, even at 2 a.m. Still, something about the way the car crawled behind me set off an alarm in my gut. It wasn't speeding up or passing me, it was just there, following me. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys for a second longer than I'd like to admit, and slid into the driver's seat. The black car stopped a few feet behind me, its headlights glaring through my rearview mirror. It sat there for a moment, as if waiting for me to do something. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, pretending like nothing was wrong. Maybe the guy was lost. Maybe he was just parking. I told myself it was nothing. But the moment I pulled out of the space, so did the black car. At this point, My heart started to pound in my chest. I turned down a side street, hoping to throw it off, but the car followed. Every twist and turn I made, it stayed with me. The street lights flickered above, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement, and all I could hear was the sound of my tires squealing against the road and my own ragged breathing. I couldn't shake it. No matter how fast I drove, no matter which streets I took, the black car was always right behind me. Not close enough to rear-end me, but always within sight. Always there. That's when I made the decision to head out of the city. I figured if I could just lose him on the highway, maybe he'd give up. I floored it down the on-ramp to I-94, my old Honda rattling as it hit 70 miles per hour. But the black car followed, its headlights shrinking in the distance as it hung back just far enough to be unnerving. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost it. The highway stretched out in front of me like an empty ribbon, and I couldn't see any other cars. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the car wasn't even following me at all. Just some unlucky coincidence. I'd seen enough weirdos during my shift that night to believe anything was possible. But then I checked my mirror. The black car was there, its headlights suddenly glaring from behind like two cold, unblinking eyes. Only this time, it was gaining on me. Fast. I slammed on the gas, pushing my poor Honda to its limits, but it wasn't enough. The black car was inches from my bumper now, its engine roaring louder than it should have. I could feel the pressure of it closing in, like it was hurting me, forcing me somewhere. Panic surged through me. I swerved off the highway, taking the next exit into an area I wasn't familiar with. The roads were narrower here, lined with thick trees on either side that seemed to swallow up the darkness. There were no streetlights, no houses, just the oppressive night, and the black car looming behind me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I drove faster than I should have, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. The black car kept pace, relentless. I couldn't see who was driving. Never once did I catch a glimpse of a face. But I knew whoever it was. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were hunting me. The road narrowed even more, twisting and turning through the trees like some kind of labyrinth. I kept glancing in the mirror, hoping the car would finally fall back, but it never did. The headlights flickered in and out of view, cutting through the dense woods like the eyes of a predator locked onto its prey. Then I saw it. Up ahead, a dead-end sign. I cursed under my breath, heart racing. There was nowhere to go. My only choice was to stop or slam into the trees. I hit the brakes hard, skidding to a halt just feet away from the end of the road. The black car pulled up behind me, its headlights bathing my car in an eerie glow. For a moment, it just sat there, engine idling. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the rearview mirror, waiting for the driver to get out, waiting for something to happen. But no one came out. The car just stayed there, engine rumbling softly, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. Maybe I should get out and confront whoever was behind the wheel. Maybe I should call the cops, though I wasn't even sure where I was. But something deep inside me, something primal, told me that leaving the safety of my car was the worst possible idea. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling, and dialed 911. The operator picked up almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? There's a car following me, I stammered. It's been chasing me for miles. I don't know where I am, but I'm at a dead end, and it's just sitting behind me. The operator's voice remained calm, but I could hear a slight edge in her tone. Stay in your car, sir. We're sending a patrol unit to your location. Can you see the driver? I swallowed hard, glancing back at the black car. No, I whispered. I can't see anyone. It's just sitting there. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Sir, the operator said slowly, can you describe the car again? What does it look like? It's a black sedan, I replied, my voice shaky. Older model, tinted windows. I don't know the make, but I stopped short. My mouth went dry, because the car wasn't there anymore. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and checked the mirror again. Nothing. The road behind me was completely empty, as if the black car had vanished into thin air. I twisted in my seat, staring out the back window, but there was no sign of it. No taillights disappearing into the distance. No sound of an engine fading away. It was just gone. "Sir?" The operator's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you still there?" I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "The car. It's gone," I whispered, disbelief flooding my senses. "It was right behind me, and now it's just gone." The operator paused for a moment, her voice cautious when she finally spoke. "Sir, stay where you are. We're still sending someone to your location." I didn't argue. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring into the darkness where the black car had once been. Minutes passed, felt like hours, and still no sign of it. Just the quiet hum of my car's engine and the endless, suffocating night pressing in around me. When the patrol car finally arrived, I almost cried in relief. The officer took my statement, but he didn't seem to believe me. Who could blame him? A car that chases you through the night, only to disappear without a trace. It sounded like the kind of story you'd hear in an urban legend. But I know what I saw. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching, because sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights,